The train pulled into Duluth station on the morning of November 3rd, 1904, carrying one passenger who should not have been alone. Arthur Grayson stepped onto the platform with a canvas bag, a wool coat stained dark along the hem, and boots that witnesses would later describe as ruined beyond repair. He was 28 years old. He had been gone for 6 weeks. He was supposed to return with 3 others. The stationmaster, Emil Vandermeer, recorded the arrival in his logbook with unusual detail. He noted that Grayson's hands shook when he signed the arrival sheet, that his signature was barely legible, that when asked where the others were, Grayson simply said, "They didn't come back," and walked toward the street. No one stopped him. Not then. By evening, the families had gathered. The Bishop family, the Kowalskis, Sarah Millhaven's mother, a widow who had already buried 2 sons. They came to the boarding house on Superior Street where Grayson had taken a room. They knocked. They called his name through the door. Some wept. Some demanded. The landlady, Mrs. Henriksen, told the county sheriff 3 days later that Grayson had not opened the door, that he had asked for water and bread to be left outside, that she had heard him pacing at night, back and forth, the floorboards creaking in rhythm. When Sheriff Roland Cates finally entered the room on the morning of November 6th, accompanied by a doctor and 2 deputies, they found Grayson seated at the small writing desk, staring at the wall. The doctor examined him and found no visible injury, no fever, no signs of starvation or exposure severe enough to explain his condition. Cates asked him directly, "Where are the others?" Grayson turned his head. His eyes, the sheriff later told a journalist, were not the eyes of a man lying. They were the eyes of a man who had decided something. I can't say. Can't or won't. Both. The room, according to the sheriff's report, smelled of damp wool and something else. Something acrid. Like burnt hair, one deputy said. The window was open despite the cold. On the desk lay a single item that had not been there when Grayson checked in. A small leather notebook, its pages filled with dense handwriting. Cates reached for it. Grayson's hand shot out and closed it. "That's private. This is a legal matter, Mr. Grayson. 3 people are missing. I know how many are missing." Cates did not press further. Not that day. He would return to that decision many times in the years that followed, wondering if he had made a mistake, wondering if the law had failed the families by respecting Grayson's silence. Because Arthur Grayson never once changed his answer. The expedition had been organized in late August 1904. It was not unusual for men and women of a certain temperament to venture into the northern wilderness in those years. Prospectors, surveyors, naturalists, people fleeing something or chasing something else. The 4 who departed Duluth on September 18th were not strangers to the woods. Arthur Grayson was a cartographer by training, employed by the Northern Pacific Railway to map potential routes and assess terrain. He was methodical, quiet, known to keep detailed journals of every survey. His supervisor described him as competent but unimaginative, which in that profession was a compliment. Thomas Bishop was a geologist, 34, married with 1 daughter. He had published 2 papers on glacial formations and had spent the previous summer documenting iron ore deposits near the Mesabi Range. His wife, Catherine, would later say that Thomas had been excited about this trip in a way he rarely was, something about an unusual rock formation reported by trappers. Leon Kowalski was the expedition's guide and hunter. 41 years old, born in Prussia. He had come to Minnesota as a child and spent most of his adult life in the forests along the Canadian border. He spoke little, drank less, and was regarded as one of the most reliable men in the trade. His wife told investigators that Leon had guided over 60 expeditions without incident. And then there was Sarah Millhaven. She was 26, unmarried, a botanical illustrator whose drawings had appeared in several academic journals. She had petitioned to join the expedition after learning of Bishop's geological focus. She believed the area might contain rare lichen species. Grayson had approved her inclusion over Bishop's initial objection. In his correspondence, he noted only that Miss Millhaven is adequately prepared and her skills may prove useful. They left Duluth with 2 weeks of provisions, surveying equipment, rifles, and a detailed map that Grayson himself had annotated. Their stated destination was a region approximately 60 miles northwest of Ely, near the Lac La Croix waterways, an area dense with old-growth forest, shallow lakes, and granite outcroppings that had caught Bishop's professional interest. They were expected back by October 15th. They were experienced. They were cautious. And when the first snow fell on October 20th, people began to worry. By the time Grayson returned alone, search parties had already been dispatched. Over the next 3 weeks, volunteers and professional trackers combed the region. They found the expedition's first campsite, abandoned but orderly. They found a second site, less orderly, with evidence of a hasty departure. They found scattered supplies, a tin pot, a torn section of canvas, a boot that Leon's wife identified by the stitching she had repaired. They did not find bodies. They did not find conclusive evidence of an animal attack, though some tracks were noted and dismissed as unreliable due to weather. They found no signs of violence between the members of the party. What they did find, approximately 12 miles from the second campsite, was a shallow ravine containing the remnants of a fire. In the ashes were fragments of cloth, a belt buckle identified as Thomas Bishop's, and something that the lead tracker, a Métis man named Baptiste Leroux, refused to describe in his official report. When pressed by journalists, he said only, "It was burned, that's all." Leroux was one of 3 men who interviewed Grayson in December, hoping that a fellow outdoorsman might succeed where the sheriff had failed. He later told his priest that Grayson had looked at him like a man looking at a ghost, and that when Leroux mentioned the ravine, Grayson had closed his eyes and asked him to leave. The notebook, the one Grayson had protected in his room, was never seen again. Speculation swirled. Some believed he had destroyed it. Others thought he had hidden it, perhaps buried it somewhere no one would find. One journalist, writing in the Duluth Herald, suggested that the notebook contained a confession. Grayson never responded to the press. The legal ambiguity was frustrating. Without bodies, there were no deaths to investigate in the usual sense. Without evidence of foul play, there was no crime to prosecute. The county coroner issued a report stating that Thomas Bishop, Leon Kowalskis, and Sarah Millhaven were presumed deceased due to unknown causes in the wilderness. The families were unsatisfied. Catherine Bishop hired a private attorney who attempted to compel Grayson's testimony through civil proceedings. The case collapsed when Grayson's own lawyer argued that no statute obligated a survivor to speak about trauma. The judge, sympathetic but constrained, agreed. Leon's wife, Anna, took a different approach. She wrote Grayson letters, dozens of them, pleading, not for legal answers but for closure, for anything. He did not reply. Sarah Millhaven's mother went to the boarding house and waited outside Grayson's door for 6 hours, weeping quietly. Mrs. Henriksen finally convinced her to leave. Grayson, inside, did not make a sound. By the spring of 1905, the families had exhausted every avenue. The story faded from the newspapers. The searches ended. Arthur Grayson remained in Duluth for another 3 months, then moved to St. Paul without notifying anyone. He found work as a clerk in a land office, a position far below his qualifications. He lived in a rented room. He attended no social functions. He joined no clubs. Those who worked with him said he was polite, punctual, and utterly without warmth. One colleague, interviewed decades later, remembered asking Grayson why he had left surveying. "I stopped trusting maps," Grayson had said. To understand what Arthur Grayson refused to say, it helps to understand what he had been before the wilderness changed him. The reconstruction begins with letters. In the archives of the Minnesota Historical Society, there exists a small collection of correspondence between Grayson and his younger sister, Margaret, who lived in Ohio. The letters span from 1898 to September 1904. They are mundane in the way that reveals character, complaints about weather, observations about work, occasional dry humor. In one letter dated April 1902, Grayson writes, "You asked if I am lonely here. I suppose I am, but it is a productive loneliness. I have my work and my books, and the knowledge that if I make an error on a map, someone might walk 20 miles in the wrong direction. That is responsibility enough. He was not a man prone to introspection. His journals, those that survived and were later donated by Margaret's estate, are technical, precise, and almost entirely devoid of personal reflection. Where another surveyor might note the beauty of a sunset, Grayson noted the angle of the light and how it affected his measurements. But people who knew him in those years described him as reliable, decent, a man who kept his word. Thomas Bishop met Grayson in 1903 during a railway survey near Lake Superior. They were not friends exactly, but they developed a professional respect. Bishop's letters to his wife mention Grayson 3 times, always in practical terms. Grayson believes we can reach the outcropping by Wednesday if the weather holds, and Grayson's maps are the most accurate I have encountered. There is one exception. In a letter dated August 30th, 1904, just weeks before the expedition, Bishop writes, "Grayson seems distracted lately. I asked if he was well, and he said he was thinking about an old survey that had gone wrong. He did not elaborate. I did not press. That earlier survey has never been conclusively identified. Leon Kowalski left behind almost no written record. He was illiterate in English, though fluent in spoken conversation. His wife, Anna, kept a diary, and in it she recorded snippets of his thoughts as he prepared for the September trip. September 10th, 1904. Leon says the route is good. The country is familiar to him. He is not worried. September 15th, 1904. Leon packed his rifle and the big knife. I asked if he expected trouble. He laughed and said the only trouble in the woods is the kind men bring with them. September 17th, 1904. Leon came home late. He had been drinking with Baptiste. He told me that Grayson asked him a strange question, whether he had ever seen a place that felt wrong. Not dangerous, just wrong. Leon said no. He thinks Grayson reads too many books. Anna's diary ends there. She stopped writing after Leon failed to return. Sarah Millhaven's inclusion in the expedition was unusual but not unprecedented. Women had participated in scientific surveys before, particularly in botanical work. What made her case notable was the mild controversy it sparked in Duluth's small academic circle. A professor at the state university wrote a letter to the Duluth News Tribune expressing concern that a woman traveling with 3 men into remote wilderness was improper and potentially dangerous. The letter was signed by 5 faculty members. Sarah responded with her own letter published 2 days later. It is one of the few pieces of writing she left behind. To the gentlemen of the faculty, I appreciate your concern for my welfare, though I did not solicit it. I have spent 3 summers documenting flora in conditions you would likely find intolerable. I am capable of managing my own safety. If you believe the presence of a woman renders men incapable of professional conduct, I suggest the failing lies not with women, but with your estimation of men. The letter was widely discussed. Some found it bold. Others found it reckless. Grayson, when asked by a colleague whether he was worried about the optics, reportedly said, "Miss Millhaven can outwalk most men I know. She'll be fine." There is no evidence that he and Sarah were close before the trip. Her letters to a cousin in Milwaukee mention Grayson only once. The cartographer is competent but cold. He speaks to his instruments with more warmth than to people. Still, she trusted him enough to go. The departure itself was unremarkable. On the morning of September 18th, the 4 of them gathered at the dock in Ely. A local outfitter provided 2 canoes and additional supplies. A photograph exists, taken by the outfitter's son, showing the group standing in front of their gear. Leon is on the left, arms crossed, his face weathered and unreadable. Thomas stands beside him, hands in his pockets, smiling slightly. Sarah is seated on a crate, her hair pinned back, her expression serious. And Grayson is on the right, holding a map, his eyes not on the camera but on the water beyond. The outfitter's son, interviewed in 1947, remembered very little, but he did recall one detail. The mapmaker, Grayson, he checked the canoes 3 times, checked the ropes, the paddles, the gear. My father told him everything was fine, but he checked again. I thought he was nervous. My father thought he was thorough. By noon, they had launched. A trapper named Oscar Lindgren saw them pass his cabin 2 days later, approximately 20 miles northwest of Ely. He waved. Grayson waved back. Lindgren later told investigators that the group seemed normal enough. That was the last confirmed sighting of all four together. The wilderness they entered was not entirely unknown, but it was isolated. The region's lakes and forests had been logged sporadically, and trappers worked the waterways. But there were vast stretches that saw no human presence for months at a time. The beauty of the area is deceptive. The forests are dense, the underbrush thick. Lakes that appear on maps sometimes vanish in drought years or expand in wet ones. Granite ridges rise without warning. It is easy to become disoriented, even for experienced navigators. Bishop's stated interest was a formation that trappers had described as stone towers, likely a cluster of glacial erratics. Grayson's annotations on the map placed the formation near a series of unnamed lakes west of Lac La Croix. Sarah's botanical focus was more flexible. She hoped to document lichen and moss species in the older forest sections, where fire had not reached in decades. Leon's role was to guide, hunt, and ensure they stayed on course. The plan was simple: travel northwest, establish a base camp, conduct surveys and collections for 1 week, then return by a slightly different route to complete the circuit. Everything suggested competence and caution, and yet, there is one piece of evidence from this period that remains difficult to interpret. In the archives of the Kowalski family, preserved by Anna and later donated to a regional museum, is a scrap of paper found in Leon's jacket pocket after his belongings were returned by the search party. The jacket was recovered from the second campsite. The paper contains a single line, written in pencil, in handwriting identified as Grayson's. "Do not follow the voices if we separate." No one knows when it was written. No one knows if Leon ever read it. The search party leader assumed it was a note about navigation, perhaps a reminder to stay together if they heard another group in the distance. But others have speculated differently. Why would Grayson write such a note? What voices? The question has never been answered. The last confirmed moment all four were together is a matter of inference and physical evidence, reconstructed by search parties, investigators, and later by researchers attempting to map the expedition's route. The first campsite was found on October 22, 1904, by a search team led by Baptiste Leroux. It was located on the southern shore of a small unnamed lake, approximately 40 miles northwest of Ely. The site was intact. Fire pit carefully constructed, minimal debris, no signs of struggle or distress. Among the items left behind, a dented coffee pot, a coil of rope, and a small wooden stake driven into the ground with a strip of cloth tied to it. Bishop's field notes, later recovered, identified this as a survey marker. The notes themselves were fragmentary but methodical. Bishop had documented geological features, sketched rock formations, and recorded coordinates. The last entry was dated September 27th. The stone formations match descriptions, though smaller than anticipated. Grayson believes we are slightly east of target. Will adjust course tomorrow. L shot a grouse. Weather clear. Nothing suggested alarm. The second campsite told a different story. It was discovered 3 days later, roughly 12 miles northwest of the first, in a clearing surrounded by dense spruce. The fire pit here was larger, and the ground around it was disturbed. Boot prints overlapping, items scattered. A tarpaulin had been stretched between trees, but one corner had come loose and was flapping in the wind when the searchers arrived. Underneath they found a torn bedroll, an overturned pack with contents partially spilled, salt, matches, a small knife, Leon's jacket, the one with Grayson's note, one of Sarah's botanical specimen cases, empty, its leather straps snapped. There was no indication of an animal attack. The supplies had not been chewed or dragged. The scattering seemed almost human, hurried, purposeful. Leroux examined the fire pit carefully. The ashes were cold, but not ancient. He estimated the fire had been extinguished within the past week. And then, There was the peculiarity that several members of the search party mentioned but struggled to articulate. The clearing felt wrong. One man, a logger named Henrik Voss, said it plainly in his report. The birds were quiet. No squirrels. The place felt watched. Baptiste Leroux was more measured. I have been in these woods 40 years. Some places have a weight to them. This was one. A third searcher, a younger man named Peter Cormack, admitted years later in a letter to a historian that he had felt compelled to leave the clearing quickly. It wasn't fear exactly. It was the feeling you get when you're somewhere you're not supposed to be. Sheriff Cates dismissed such observations as superstition, but he did note in his official report that the camp had been abandoned with uncharacteristic haste. From the second camp, the trail became harder to follow. The search party found footprints leading northwest, 2 sets, possibly 3, difficult to distinguish due to rain that had fallen in the intervening days. The prints led toward a steep, rocky slope. At the base of the slope, they found Sarah's other boot. Just the boot. No blood, no fabric, no explanation for why she would have removed it or why it would be there, alone, laces still tied. One of the searchers suggested she might have lost it while climbing. Another pointed out that the boot showed no signs of damage. It had been taken off, not torn off. Sheriff Cates bagged the boot and continued the search. The ravine was discovered on November 1st. It was narrow, perhaps 15 feet across at its widest point, and roughly 30 feet deep. Water trickled along the bottom, feeding into a creek that eventually joined a larger tributary. The sides were steep, but not impassable. At the bottom they found the remains of a fire. Not a cooking fire, not a signal fire. The ashes were deep, suggesting the fire had burned hot and long. Mixed within were the objects that would haunt the investigators: fragments of cloth, buttons, the belt buckle, and what Baptiste Leroux described in his private notes as something that might have been leather or might have been something else. No bones, no teeth, no definitive remains. The fire had consumed nearly everything. Cates ordered the ashes sifted. They recovered small metal objects, a pencil nub, a buckle from a pack strap, a brass button stamped with a manufacturer's mark that matched Leon's coat. But the question that dominated the investigation was simple and impossible. Why would someone build such a fire? To stay warm. The weather had been cold, but not lethally so. To signal. The ravine was a poor location. Smoke would dissipate before rising above the tree line. To destroy evidence. Evidence of what? 12 miles east of the ravine, cutting back toward the route to Duluth, the search party found a third site. It was not a camp. It was a shelter. Crude, makeshift, built into the lee of a fallen tree. Branches had been piled to form a windbreak. Inside, the ground was compressed, as if someone had lain there for an extended period. There were no supplies, no fire pit, no tools, but there was a smell. Multiple searchers noted it. Henrik Voss described it as sour, like old sweat and something metallic. Another man said it reminded him of a slaughterhouse, and scratched into the bark of the fallen tree, barely visible, were marks. Not words, not symbols, just lines, deep, frantic, repetitive, as if someone had dragged a knife or a sharp stone across the bark over and over. Cates counted 47 individual marks before he stopped. The timeline remained elusive, but investigators constructed a tentative sequence. The group reached the first campsite and stayed at least 2 nights. They moved to the second campsite, possibly in pursuit of Bishop's geological target. Something happened at the second site, something that caused them to leave in haste. At least one member of the party ended up at the ravine. The fire was built. Items were burned. Grayson, at some point, separated from the others and made his way back to Duluth. But the sequence raised more questions than it answered. If there had been an accident, why not bury the dead? If there had been an attack, where were the bodies? If the group had fractured due to conflict, why would Grayson burn their belongings? And why, if he was the only survivor, did he refuse to explain? One detail emerged months later, almost by accident. A trapper named Emil Vandermeer came forward in March 1905, long after the official searches had ended. He had been working a line of traps west of Lac La Croix in mid-October and had heard something unusual. Shouting. He couldn't make out words. The distance was too great, but he heard voices, multiple voices, echoing across the water. He assumed it was another trapping party and thought nothing of it. But then, he said, the shouting had stopped suddenly, and after the silence, he heard a single voice calling out, over and over, the same word, though Toivonen couldn't decipher it. He paddled closer, curious, but by the time he reached the far shore there was nothing. No voices, no movement. He continued his work and forgot about it until he heard about the missing expedition. When investigators pressed him for details, how many voices, what direction, what time of day, he became uncertain. Maybe 3 voices, maybe 4. Late afternoon, he thought, or evening. He couldn't be sure. But he was certain of one thing. The final voice, the one calling out alone, had sounded desperate, like someone trying to find something they'd lost. He said. Arthur Grayson was not present when the search parties made these discoveries. He had already retreated into silence. But one man did manage to confront him directly about the evidence. Baptiste Leroux, driven by something he refused to name, went to Grayson's boarding house in early December. He did not go as part of an official investigation. He went, as he told his priest, because he needed to look Grayson in the eye. Mrs. Henriksen let him in reluctantly. Leroux found Grayson seated by the window, staring out at the snow. I found your camp, Leroux said. The second one. Grayson did not turn. I found the ravine. Still nothing. I found the shelter. Grayson's hands resting on his knees tightened. What happened out there? For a long moment there was only the sound of wind against glass. Then Grayson spoke, his voice so quiet Leroux almost missed it. I can't. Can't or won't. Does it matter? Leroux stepped closer. Those families deserve to know. Grayson finally turned. His face, Leroux later said, was like stone, but his eyes were not. If I told you, Grayson said slowly, it wouldn't help them. It would only hurt them more. You don't get to decide that. I already did. Leroux left without another word. He never spoke to Grayson again, but he told his priest one final detail. As he was leaving, he glanced back at Grayson, and Grayson was crying, silently, without moving, tears running down his face as he stared out the window. I don't think he was protecting himself, Leroux said. I think he was protecting them, or their memory, or something. The priest asked what Leroux believed had happened. Leroux shook his head. I don't know, but I think Arthur Grayson does, and I think it's killing him. The pressure on Arthur Grayson did not come all at once. It accumulated slowly, like snow on a roof, until the weight became unbearable. In the months following his return, the families pursued every available avenue. Legal, social, moral. They wrote letters. They hired investigators. They appealed to the railway company, the county government, the church. Grayson refused them all. Not angrily, not defensively. He simply said no, over and over, in the same flat tone. Catherine Bishop, Thomas's widow, was perhaps the most persistent. She was a school teacher, articulate and determined, and she believed, rightly or wrongly, that Grayson owed her the truth. In January 1905, she published an open letter in the Duluth Herald. To Mr. Arthur Grayson, my husband trusted you. He believed in your competence and your character. He left his home, his daughter, and his wife in your care, however indirectly, and he did not return. You did. I do not ask you to justify yourself. I do not ask you to defend your actions. I ask only that you give me the mercy of knowing how my husband died. Did he suffer? Was he afraid? Did he speak of us at the end? These are not legal questions. They are human ones. I beg you, as one human being to another, to answer them. The letter was widely read. It was reprinted in papers across Minnesota. Readers flooded the editorial pages with opinions, some sympathetic to Catherine, others strangely defensive of Grayson's silence. Grayson did not respond. Catherine tried once more in person, traveling to St. Paul in February. She waited outside the land office where he worked. When he emerged at the end of the day, she approached him calmly, without anger. "Mr. Grayson, I only want to know if he was in pain." Grayson stopped. He looked at her for a long moment, long enough that she later said she thought he might speak. Instead, he walked past her. She did not follow. Anna Kowalski took a different approach. She did not appeal to Grayson's conscience. She appealed to his faith. In March, she sent him a letter containing a single pressed flower and a brief note. "Leon used to bring me flowers from the woods. I do not ask you to speak to me. I ask you to speak to God. Whatever happened, he already knows. You are only lying to yourself." There is no record of Grayson responding, but Mrs. Henriksen, who forwarded his mail after he moved, noted that he received the letter and that he did not discard it. Years later, after Grayson's death, a small pressed flower was found among his possessions. It may have been the same one. Sarah Millhaven's mother, Constance, had the least recourse. Sarah had been her only surviving child. Her husband had died in a mill accident years earlier. She was alone. She did not write letters or appeal to newspapers. She did not hire lawyers. She simply appeared at Grayson's door one evening in April 1905 and sat outside it, as she had once before. This time she spoke, not loudly, not accusingly. She spoke as if Grayson were sitting beside her. She told him about Sarah as a child, about how she had loved drawing plants and collecting leaves, about how she had once walked 6 miles to see a rare orchid and had come home sunburned and triumphant. She talked for over an hour. Mrs. Henriksen, listening from the hallway, said later that she could hear Grayson inside the room, moving quietly, and that once, just once, she thought she heard him stifle a sob. When Constance finally left, she placed her hand flat against the door and said, "She was good. Whatever you think happened, please remember that she was good." Grayson did not open the door, but Mrs. Henriksen swore she heard him say very quietly, "I know." The legal attempts to compel testimony failed, but they did produce one significant piece of evidence: Grayson's written deposition, submitted through his attorney in June 1905. It is a brief document, just under 2 pages, and it reveals almost nothing. But it is the only formal statement Grayson ever made. The relevant excerpts: "I departed Duluth with Thomas Bishop, Leon Kowalski, and Sarah Millhaven on September 18, 1904. We traveled by canoe to the region northwest of Ely. The journey was uneventful. We established 2 campsites over the course of approximately 10 days. During this time, we conducted geological and botanical surveys as planned. On or around September 30th, circumstances arose that resulted in the separation of the party. I was unable to locate the others. I returned to Duluth alone. I do not know the precise fate of my companions, but I believe they are deceased. I have no further information that would aid in the recovery of remains or the determination of cause of death." The deposition was signed and notarized. Grayson's attorney argued that his client had fulfilled all legal obligations. Catherine Bishop's attorney pointed out that the deposition answered nothing. "What circumstances?" he demanded in court. "What does separation mean? Why couldn't he locate them?" The judge, clearly frustrated, asked Grayson directly if he would clarify. Grayson, present in the courtroom, simply said, "No, Your Honor. Mr. Grayson, I must inform you that your refusal to cooperate reflects poorly on your character." "I understand, Your Honor. Do you have nothing else to say?" Grayson hesitated. Then, "Only that I wish I did." The case was dismissed. Public opinion turned slowly against Grayson, though it was never unanimous. Some believed he was a coward. Others believed he was a murderer. A few believed he was protecting someone, though who, and from what, was never clear. But there was a minority who believed something else. A letter to the St. Paul Pioneer Press, signed only as "a reader," captured this perspective. "We assume Mr. Grayson's silence is selfish. But what if it is the opposite? What if he refuses to speak not because he is ashamed, but because he believes the truth would be unbearable? What if he is carrying the weight alone so that others do not have to?" The letter sparked debate, but changed few minds. The most surprising intervention came from an unexpected source. Dr. Elliot Marsh, a professor of psychology at the University of Minnesota. In August 1905, Dr. Marsh published an essay in an academic journal titled Trauma and the Limits of Testimony. Though he never mentioned Grayson by name, the case was clearly his subject. Marsh argued that certain experiences exceed the capacity of language, that silence in some cases is not refusal but collapse, the mind's inability to translate horror into words. He wrote, "We demand that survivors speak, as if speech were simple, as if memory could be rendered linear and coherent, but trauma fractures. It scatters, and for some, the act of reconstruction is not cathartic, it is re-traumatizing. Silence, then, may be the only survival." The essay was widely discussed in academic circles but had little impact on public perception. Most people did not read academic journals. Most people simply wanted answers. Grayson's isolation deepened. He stopped attending church. He stopped responding to mail. His colleagues at the land office reported that he worked efficiently, but spoke only when necessary. One man, a clerk named Howard Finch, tried to befriend him. They occasionally ate lunch together in silence. Once, Finch asked Grayson if he regretted the expedition. Grayson thought for a long time. "Every day," he finally said. "Do you think you could have saved them?" Another long pause. "I don't know." Finch never asked again. There was one final strange incident in the aftermath, an event that has never been fully explained. In October 1905, exactly 1 year after the expedition, a package arrived at the Duluth post office addressed to Sheriff Cates. It had been mailed from St. Paul. Inside was a small bundle wrapped in canvas. When Cates opened it, he found a strip of cloth, burned at the edges, a rusted buckle, a folded piece of paper. The paper contained a single sentence, handwritten, "They did not suffer long." The handwriting was not Grayson's. Cates launched an investigation, but the trail went nowhere. The package had been mailed from a public post office. No clerk remembered who sent it. Cates believed it was Grayson, that he had disguised his handwriting or had someone else write it for him. But he could not prove it, and even if it had been Grayson, the statement raised as many questions as it answered. What did "not long" mean? Hours? Minutes? And what exactly had caused the suffering? By 1906, the public had largely moved on. The families, broken by grief and frustration, ceased their efforts. Catherine Bishop remarried in 1908. She never spoke publicly about Thomas again. Anna Kowalskis moved to Milwaukee to live with her sister. She kept Leon's rifle above her mantle until she died in 1923. Constance Millhaven remained in Duluth, teaching piano to children. She was known to be kind, if distant. She never mentioned Sarah except to say, when asked, "I had a daughter once." And Arthur Grayson lived quietly in St. Paul, working, walking, existing. He kept no friends. He formed no attachments. He was, by all accounts, a man who had chosen to disappear without leaving. One journalist, writing a retrospective in 1912, described him as a ghost in a living man's body. It was not inaccurate. Arthur Grayson died on March 14, 1931, in a boarding house in St. Paul. He was 54 years old. The cause of death was listed as pneumonia, though his landlord noted that Grayson had been frail for months, eating little, sleeping poorly. He died alone. No family had been in contact with him for years. His sister, Margaret, had passed away in 1918. The landlord, a man named Samuel Oakes, found him in the morning, lying on his narrow bed, hands folded across his chest. The room was tidy. The window was open despite the cold. On the small table beside the bed was a single item, a compass. It was not a standard surveyor's compass. It was old, brass, its glass face cracked. Engraved on the back were the initials T.B. Thomas Bishop's compass. How Grayson had acquired it, or kept it, was never explained. It had not been among the items recovered from the campsites. It had not been listed in any inventory. Oakes turned it over to the authorities. There was brief discussion about returning it to Catherine Bishop, but by then she had moved to California and could not be reached. The compass was eventually donated to the Minnesota Historical Society, where it remains in storage, catalogued simply as Compass, brass, origin unknown, circa 1900. Grayson left no will. His possessions were minimal: clothing, a few books, the compass, and a small locked box. The box was opened by a court-appointed executor. Inside were a photograph of the 4 expedition members, the same one taken in Eli a pressed flower, a letter, sealed, addressed to "Whoever finds this." The letter was read privately by the executor and then sealed again, in accordance with Grayson's instructions. Its contents have never been disclosed. The executor, a lawyer named Raymond Thorne, later told a colleague only that the letter explained nothing and confirmed everything. When pressed, he refused to elaborate. In accordance with Grayson's final written instructions, found in a separate envelope, the letter was to be kept sealed for 50 years and then destroyed, unread. Whether those instructions were followed is unknown. Historians have returned to the case intermittently over the past century. In 1954, a researcher named Dr. Virginia Halstead conducted interviews with surviving relatives and witnesses. Her findings, published in a regional history journal, added little to the factual record, but offered a psychological portrait of Grayson as a man crushed beneath the weight of unspoken knowledge. In 1978, a true crime writer attempted to reopen the case, arguing that Grayson had murdered his companions in a fit of wilderness madness. The theory was sensational and unsupported by evidence. It was roundly criticized by historians. In 2003, a team of researchers used modern GPS and archival maps to retrace the expedition's route. They located the first campsite and what they believed to be the second. They found no new evidence. The ravine, if it still exists, could not be definitively identified. The forest has changed. Fires, logging, and time have erased much. The question remains, what happened in those woods? The evidence suggests separation, panic, a fire, death, but it does not explain why. Some have theorized an accident, a fall, a drowning, hypothermia. But why would Grayson burn the bodies? And why refuse to explain something so simple? Others have suggested conflict, that the group fractured, that Grayson was forced to choose sides or save himself. But there is no evidence of interpersonal tension before the trip, and Grayson's character, by all accounts, was not that of a man prone to violence. A few have proposed animal attack, though Baptiste Leroux, an expert tracker, found no evidence of predation. And then there are the stranger theories. One researcher suggested disease, that the group contracted something that caused delirium and death, and that Grayson, as the sole survivor, burned the bodies to prevent contagion. Another proposed that they encountered someone else in the woods, a hermit, a fugitive, and that violence followed. But none of these explanations account for Grayson's silence. If it had been an accident, why not say so? If it had been a crime committed by another, why not report it? If it had been disease, why not warn others? The most compelling interpretation, and the one this reconstruction supports, is that Grayson's silence was intentional and protective, that he believed the truth, whatever it was, would harm the families more than help them. Consider his words to Baptiste Leroux. "If I told you, it wouldn't help them. It would only hurt them more." Consider the anonymous package sent to Sheriff Cates. "They did not suffer long." Consider his deposition. "I believe they are deceased." Not "they are." Believe. Grayson was a precise man. His choice of words was deliberate. He believed they were dead, but he could not, or would not, confirm it. Why? One possibility, supported by circumstantial evidence, is that Grayson witnessed something so disturbing that he could not bear to describe it, not because it was violent in a simple sense, but because it was degrading, dehumanizing, something that would rob the dead of dignity in the eyes of those who loved them. Dr. Marsh's essay on trauma may be relevant here. He wrote, "Certain truths do not enlighten, they only corrupt." And a person who has seen such truths may choose silence not out of selfishness, but out of love. If the others died in a manner that was slow, agonizing, or grotesque, if they succumbed to exposure, starvation, or madness in a way that left them unrecognizable, Grayson may have believed that sparing the families those details was an act of mercy. The fire in the ravine supports this. If he burned the bodies, it was not to destroy evidence of a crime. It was to ensure they would not be found in a state that would haunt those who saw them. Another possibility is that Grayson carried guilt, not for murder, but for survival. Survivor's guilt is a well-documented phenomenon. Men who return from war or disaster often struggle with the question, why me? If Grayson made a choice in the wilderness, if he chose to save himself rather than die trying to save the others, he may have believed that admitting this would dishonor their memory. He may have thought silence was the only way to preserve the idea that he had done everything he could, even if it wasn't true. A third possibility, darker and more speculative, is that Grayson witnessed something he could not reconcile with his understanding of the world, not supernatural. This reconstruction avoids such explanations, but psychologically shattering. There are documented cases of people experiencing extreme isolation or stress who develop shared delusions, hallucinations, or psychotic breaks. If the group descended into such a state, if they turned on each other or on themselves in ways that defied reason, Grayson may have chosen silence to protect not only the families, but the public's understanding of what human beings are capable of under duress. But these are only theories. The truth died with Arthur Grayson, and perhaps that was his intention. In the end, the story of Arthur Grayson is not about what happened. It is about what was not said. It is about the space between words, the weight of silence, the things we carry alone because we believe no one else can bear them. Grayson could have spoken. He chose not to. And that choice, whatever motivated it, defined the rest of his life. He was not a hero. He was not a villain. He was a man who went into the wilderness with 3 others and came back alone. And he spent 27 years refusing to explain why. The families never received closure. The bodies were never found. The questions were never answered. But in his final letter, the one sealed and possibly destroyed, Grayson may have left a clue. Raymond Thorne, the executor who read it, described it as explaining nothing and confirming everything. That paradox is perhaps the closest we will ever come to understanding. Grayson's silence was not empty. It was full of grief, full of knowledge, full of a truth too heavy to share, and he carried it alone until it killed him. There is a gravestone in Oakland Cemetery in St. Paul, simple and unadorned. It reads, Arthur Grayson, 1876-1931. Cartographer, no epitaph, no sentiment, just a name and a profession. But if you stand there long enough, as this historian did on a cold morning in February, you begin to feel the weight of what is not written. You begin to understand that some silences are not voids, they are monuments. And Arthur Grayson's silence is the only monument Thomas Bishop, Leon Kowalski, and Sarah Millhaven will ever have.